There's a kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, it stalks. That November evening, Marietta, Georgia lay under a blanket of stillness that felt wrong. The wind didn't whistle. The streetlights flickered like they knew something. And at the edge of the cul-de-sac, a predator waited in the folds of the dark. Sarah Tokar had no idea she was driving into a trap. The tires of her minivan whispered against the concrete as she returned from a long holiday pilgrimage, 9 hours of highway fatigue behind her, 2 drowsy boys in the back, and home just ahead. Almost there, she said, casting a weary smile at the rearview mirror. Her voice carried that peculiar tone only mothers master, soft, but laced with steel. The porch was still cloaked in shadow, the house unlit. But Sarah had lived there long enough not to question it. What she didn't know was that she wasn't the only one who'd come home that night. Near the corner of the garage, nestled in the inky blur between structure and shrub, a figure stood statue still. His breath didn't fog. His hands didn't shake. He wasn't there to rob. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to end something. The moment Sarah stepped out, he moved with the precision of a guillotine. The muzzle of a sawed-off shotgun found her temple like it had been there 1,000 times before. Her eyes widened, but her instincts kicked in. 2 children were inside the car. She climbed back into the driver's seat as ordered, her hands trembling on the wheel. Left, the voice said, low and flat. She turned. The tires obeyed. Now right. She hesitated. The road he pointed to wasn't a road at all, it was a forgotten patch of gravel and weeds, a vacant lot lost to time. Please, she whispered, the word barely audible, I don't want to go in there. And that was when the darkness answered. A single explosion tore through the silence, close range, final. Her body went slack. The vehicle rolled forward a few yards in stunned inertia before the man reached across her lifeless form and snatched her handbag. Then he disappeared, swallowed whole by the night. 2 boys remained. In the back seat, silence coiled around them like smoke. The older child, 6 years old, barely past the age of picture books and playgrounds, climbed over his mother's body. He turned off the ignition. Then, with a grip that only terror could forge, he took his younger brother's hand and stepped out into the cold. They walked, no tears, no screams, just 2 small silhouettes under a tired moon, drifting toward a porch light that might still be kind. A door opened. The world changed. Moments later, the buzz of police radios sliced through the quiet. Cobb County cruisers fanned out over Powers Road. Sirens wailed their mechanical sorrow as officers secured the scene and homicide detectives began their slow waltz with death. Sarah Tokar was officially declared the victim. Inside the vehicle, blood told its own story, spray pattern, trajectory, proximity. No shell casing, no trace of the assailant. The weapon? A .410 sawed-off shotgun. A ghost's weapon, intimate, deadly, and silent when it counted. The boys, too young to comprehend the full scope of what they'd witnessed, gave the only description they could, a dark-skinned man in a sweatshirt and knit cap. The eldest added one chilling detail, the gun, he said, looked like a pirate's. Officers exchanged glances. The next call was for their father, Fred Tokar. But he was still out of state, holed up in a Montgomery hotel on business. He didn't yet know his wife's body was cooling in the car she used to sing lullabies in. That their home had become a crime scene. That the woman he once married had met an end scripted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. When police arrived at the Tokar residence, they found no broken glass, no overturned drawers, no looted jewelry boxes. But one thing did catch their eye, a metal security bar, meant to hold the sliding glass door shut, was on the floor. The alarm didn't go off, an officer muttered. Another took close-ups. No signs of struggle. No clear theft. No story that made sense. Detective Arthur Hall would later recall that moment with a grim nod. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This was the kind of place where the worst thing that happened was a mailbox getting smashed. But now we had a mother executed in front of her kids. It shook the bones of this whole town. And somewhere beneath that quiet, a secret was beginning to breathe. When Fred Tokar returned to Atlanta, the world he stepped into was colder than the December air. A husband. A father. A defense attorney with a name that carried weight in legal circles. But now, he was something else, a man under a microscope. The second his plane touched down, he was met not by family, but by detectives. They didn't cuff him. Not yet. But the questions had begun before his luggage hit the carousel. Tokar arrived at headquarters with his own lawyer in tow, sharp suit, sharp jaw, eyes that scan everything twice. Fred knew the game. He'd played it from both sides of the courtroom. That made him dangerous. Or smart. Maybe both. I just want to help, Tokar said, his voice rehearsed, almost gentle. But I need to know everything you've got. He told them where he'd been visiting a client in a Montgomery prison. His alibi was clean, clocked, and cross-verified within hours. But clean didn't mean innocent. It just meant harder to catch. Detectives walked with him through his suburban fortress, a two-story dream lined with expensive art and silent tension. He guided them through the house like a host at a wake, stopping only when they reached the basement. "This is my office," he offered, hand on the doorknob like a man trying to seem cooperative. "Look around. Take your time." They did. One item drew their attention, a safe, small but serious, tucked against the wall like a secret. "Open." "Empty." "What usually stays in here?" one detective asked. $1,500 in cash, Tokar replied, without flinching. Sarah might have taken it for the trip. Or, maybe someone else figured out the combo. "You write it down?" "Yeah. But only Sarah and I knew where." The silence that followed was heavier than the concrete floor beneath them. No signs of a break-in. No forced entry. No alarm. And yet someone had waited in that garage. Something didn't add up. Investigators left with questions crawling under their skin. Was this a burglary gone sideways? Or something far more deliberate? Meanwhile, the autopsy delivered its verdict. The wound matched the story, a sawed-off .410 shotgun, discharged at close range. The barrel shortened, the grip hacked for concealment. A weapon built for one thing, execution. The same kind the boy described as a pirate gun. It didn't take a profiler to see this wasn't random. But without fingerprints, DNA, or shell casings, the killer had left behind nothing but silence and trauma. Still, something in the air was beginning to shift. Enter Buddy Parker. A former U.S. attorney with a nose for federal rot, Parker had seen Fred Tokar's name before. Years back, Tokar had served as a prosecutor. But lately, he was defending the kind of men who made their money in shadows: drug traffickers, smugglers, ghosts with gold-plated lawyers. When I heard who the victim was, Parker later said, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. You don't marry a man like Fred Tokar and end up murdered in your driveway by accident. The theory emerged like a bruise under the surface. Sarah Tokar hadn't been a victim of chance. She'd been a target. Then, two women walked into the precinct. Not strangers, family. Sarah's sister and cousin, faces drawn and determined. They weren't just grieving. They were ready. We have something you need to see, the sister said, placing a folder on the table. Bank records. Copies of documents Sarah had handed over in secret years ago. She told me if anything ever happened to her, take these to the police. Inside, statements from overseas accounts bearing Fred Tokar's name. Turks and Caicos. Montserrat. The Bahamas. Business fronts. Hidden assets. False owners. A money trail dressed in expensive shoes and foreign soil. Sarah hadn't just been scared. She'd been preparing. She wanted to leave him, her cousin explained. But he always threatened to take the kids. The sister nodded, tears brimming. She said if she lost custody, she'd lose everything. These documents, they were her only protection. What Sarah uncovered wasn't just a crack in the marriage. It was the motive for murder. The detectives called the FBI that night. Because now, this wasn't just about a killing. It was about conspiracy. The call came in just after dusk, quiet, almost casual. Cobb County detectives picked up, expecting more dead ends. But this wasn't that. 2 names. 2 whispers from the underworld. And suddenly, the story had new legs. Fred Tokar's offshore accounts had raised the stakes. But what caught the FBI's attention was what they implied: not just fraud, but orchestration. Somebody had made a decision. Someone had executed a plan. That plan needed a hand. His name was Eddie Lawrence. On paper, Lawrence was nothing special, a small-time entrepreneur with a string of failed businesses and a few bad checks in his wake. But dig deeper, and he started to look like something else: a conduit. A middleman. The man you called when you didn't want to get your own hands dirty. He and Tokar shared more than just business ties. They'd built companies together: shells in construction, mortgage lending, even vending machines. But Lawrence's real talent wasn't in drywall or loans. It was in looking like he belonged. When police traced his phone records, the pattern hit like a punch: calls between Lawrence and Tokar on the very day Sarah Tokar was murdered. Not once. Several times. They brought him in under different charges: check fraud. Enough to hold him. Not enough to spook him. At least, not yet. But word on the street was moving faster than court dockets. An informant, unnamed, unseen, stepped forward with something incendiary Lawrence had been asking around before the murder. Looking for someone who could take care of a problem. He wasn't subtle. He needed a man who didn't ask questions. He found one. Curtis Rower. A small-time thief with a taste for narcotics and a record thick enough to fold. Rower had been circling rock bottom for years. That made him the perfect candidate: desperate, reckless, disposable. The tip was enough. Authorities secured a warrant and went hunting. December 22, 1992. The winter chill bit through jackets like broken glass. A SWAT team gathered outside a rundown house on the outskirts of town. No shouting. No flashbangs. Just a knock and silence. Then a sound. A scrape. A shift beneath the bed. Come out slowly. 2 hands emerged, trembling, empty. Curtis Rower. He didn't fight. Didn't speak. Just let the cuffs close around his wrists like he knew this day had been carved into fate. At headquarters, he told his version of the truth. "I didn't shoot her," he said, almost pleading. "I was just there to scare her." According to Rower, it was Lawrence who fired the weapon. He claimed the plan had been to frighten Sarah into compliance, make it look like a carjacking gone sideways. But when she refused to turn into the abandoned lot, Lawrence panicked. That's when the trigger was pulled. Was it true? Or was he deflecting blame? Only one person had seen it all: the 6-year-old boy. The eldest son. The child who had reached over his mother's body to kill the engine. He was brought in for a lineup. One by one, men were paraded before the mirror. Including Rower. The boy's face flickered with confusion. His eyes scanned them all. I don't know. The weight of that night had blurred the image. Memory had been devoured by fear. No confirmation. No denial. Still, the pieces were aligning. Lawrence was charged with conspiracy. But he kept his lips sealed. Fred Tokar, meanwhile, received the news in Florida: 2 men were behind bars for Sarah's death. His reaction was off. No relief. No gratitude. No call to justice. Instead, he vanished. Sarah's father, concerned, drove to the hotel Tokar was staying in. What he found was the beginning of an unraveling. Fred Tokar, unconscious on the bed. An empty bottle of sleeping pills on the nightstand. The front desk called for help. An ambulance arrived. Paramedics worked quickly. It was the night before Christmas Eve. And Fred Tokar had just tried to vanish permanently. But fate wasn't done with him yet. He survived. The next morning, wrapped in hospital sheets and shame, he faced the cameras. "This has been hard for me and the boys," he murmured. I just want to be left alone." He announced he was relocating to Florida for good, taking his children with him. The press surged with questions. "Mr. Tokar, do you think Eddie Lawrence was involved?" He didn't answer. Just walked away. But he wouldn't get far. Because in a quiet room, under federal protection, a man was finally ready to speak. Eddie Lawrence wanted to make a deal. The man who once stayed silent was now ready to talk. After 7 long months behind bars, Eddie Lawrence had run out of options and nerve. Isolation has a way of peeling a man open, exposing what he'd rather bury. And when the FBI offered him a lifeline, he took it. A deal. In exchange for the truth. Under cover of night, Lawrence was quietly moved from his cell to a safe house deep in Georgia, guarded, undisclosed. No bars. No press. Just a handful of agents and the weight of what he was about to say. DEA agent Jeff Delman remembered the tension in that room. "We knew this was our shot. If Tokar really ordered the hit, Lawrence was the one who could take him down." Eddie sat across from them, smaller now, no longer the middleman but a witness to murder. And he told them everything. According to Lawrence, the wheels had been in motion long before Sarah Tokar drew her last breath. It began with papers, documents she shouldn't have seen. Financial statements. Offshore accounts. Names connected to drug money and laundering schemes. Names that pointed back to one man, her husband. Fred Tokar wasn't just living 2 lives. He was running from both. Sarah had found the records. And she had leverage. She wanted out of the marriage, the house, the lies. But Tokar couldn't let her go. Not with what she knew. "If she divorces me, she'll take everything," he told Lawrence. His solution wasn't negotiation. It was elimination. At first, the plan was simple: kill her in his office, make it look like a robbery. But that fell through. So did Plan B, an ambush at home. Eventually, Tokar settled on something colder. Cleaner. A hit disguised as a carjacking. He offered Lawrence $25,000 to make it happen. And one detail chilled the agents to the bone. Tokar wanted it done in front of the children. He said, if the boys witnessed it, they'd think it was random, Lawrence admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Even in a room full of seasoned investigators, that landed like a punch. Lawrence didn't want the job. But Tokar reminded him he owed money. Business loans. Debts with no paperwork, just expectations. And this was how he'd pay. So Lawrence found someone willing. Curtis Rower. A man living on the edge, trading desperation for dollars. Lawrence offered him $5,000. No names. No questions. Just a task: intercept Sarah when she returned from her trip, force her to drive, and end it. But Rower panicked. When Sarah resisted, he froze. That's when Lawrence stepped in. He grabbed the shotgun and pulled the trigger himself. It was quick. Cold. Efficient. They fled the scene, taking her handbag to complete the illusion. A senseless act, staged to look like it had no meaning. But underneath it all, it was meticulous. Planned. Murder for silence. Now, sitting across from the FBI, Eddie Lawrence agreed to testify. He would name Fred Tokar as the man behind it all. The final piece had fallen into place. Now it was time to bring the architect to justice. But the FBI couldn't risk a mistake. Fred Tokar wasn't just a suspect, he was a strategist. A man with influence, money, and enough legal knowledge to slip through the cracks if given an inch. So they devised a trap worthy of the man who thought he was untouchable. And this time, the net was closing. By now, Fred Tokar had receded into a quieter life, or so it seemed. Tucked away in Florida with his sons, he played the role of grieving widower and reluctant public figure. The press kept circling, flashing headlines, but he dodged them with practiced ease. No statements. No answers. Just silence. But the FBI wasn't watching him for quotes. They were watching for a misstep. Behind the scenes, a legal storm was building. Federal agents were preparing to deploy one of their sharpest tools, the RICO Act. Originally crafted to dismantle organized crime syndicates, RICO allowed prosecutors to go after those who pulled strings from the shadows even if they never pulled a trigger. And that's exactly what Fred Tokar had done. He hadn't held the gun. But he had ordered the shot. With Lawrence ready to testify, they had their linchpin. A direct line between Tokar and murder for hire. Now they just had to get close enough to snap the trap shut. So they used Tokar's ego against him. Agents posing as journalists set up shop outside his Florida home, pretending to shoot a follow-up story on the arrests. Cameras pointed. Mics prepped. But they weren't recording news, they were recording behavior. And Tokar gave them exactly what they needed. Annoyed by the so-called reporters crowding his property, he called local police, demanding they remove the media circus. Minutes later, officers arrived. But these weren't just local cops. Among them were federal agents ready, waiting. When Tokar stepped outside, the ambush unfolded in perfect silence. Fred Tokar, one of them said calmly, "You're under arrest." No chase. No outburst. Just the clink of steel on wrists. His children watched from behind the curtains as their father was led across the lawn, a lawyer turned prisoner, a man whose secrets had finally outgrown their hiding places. The charges came fast and brutal. Conspiracy to commit murder. Murder for hire. Money laundering. Racketeering under RICO. Tokar was stunned. Not because he hadn't seen it coming, but because, somewhere deep inside, he still believed he could beat it. He pleaded not guilty. The courtroom became a war zone of evidence and strategy. But Tokar's reputation, once his greatest armor, was now another weight dragging him down. Witnesses stepped forward. Financial trails were unearthed. Bank records. Business fronts. Testimonies. And then there was Eddie Lawrence. He took the stand and told the truth, or at least the version that matched every forensic thread. He detailed the conversations, the payment, the planning. He described the garage, the lot, the moment Sarah Tokar said no. And how that word got her killed. In the end, the jury didn't take long. Guilty. On all counts. In 1997, Fred Tokar was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, with no chance of parole. The man who once advised on money laundering law now lives behind bars, stripped of power, stripped of pretense. Sarah was gone. Her sons had lost both parents, one to violence, the other to ambition. Justice had arrived, but it came late, and it came hard. The courtroom lights dimmed. The verdict echoed through wood-paneled walls like a long-awaited thunderclap. But justice, even when served, leaves shadows behind. Fred Tokar was locked away, a man who once walked polished courthouse halls, now pacing a prison cell built for men like the ones he used to defend. He'd gambled everything on control, over his wife, over his secrets, over the truth itself. And he lost. His sentence, for life terms, no parole, no appeals worth breathing on. Curtis Rower, the man who had stood in the dark with a shotgun and a flicker of conscience, was sentenced to life in prison. Eddie Lawrence, the middleman who finally cracked under the weight of guilt and pressure, received 10.5 years for his role in the killing. Cooperation bought him time, but not peace. And Sarah Tokar? She was more than just a victim in an open and shut file. She was a woman who saw too much and chose not to look away. She had gathered the evidence. Protected it. Entrusted it to people she loved. She knew what was coming and tried to stop it the only way she could. But in the end, it wasn't enough. What she uncovered didn't just cost her a marriage. It cost her life. For investigators, the Tokar case became legend, a blueprint of deception, greed, and calculated cruelty. It showed how RICO laws could reach into places no one expected, into households, into boardrooms, into marriages. FBI agent Michael Twible would later call it one of the most haunting cases of his career. "I've seen organized crime, drug lords, and cartel violence. But this was different. This was a man willing to erase the mother of his children to keep his world intact. That's not just criminal. That's chilling. Former U.S. Attorney Buddy Parker added. Fred Tokar had the perfect life, wealth, power, a beautiful family. But he couldn't risk losing control. So he destroyed it all. Sarah's sons, now grown, carry the silence of that night in their own way. They were just 6 and 4 when their world shattered. They saw the unthinkable. Remembered the unimaginable. And yet they endured. Sarah's family made sure Tokar would never have influence over the boys again. They were raised far from the legacy of his crimes, far from the house where the alarm had stayed silent. Years later, people still speak of the case in hushed tones. It wasn't just another true crime story, it was a cautionary tale wrapped in betrayal, stitched together by greed, and sealed with blood. The headlines called it a murder for hire. But in truth, it was a man trying to rewrite the future by erasing the past. He failed. Because no matter how deep the crime was buried, Sarah Tokar had already left behind the one thing he couldn't silence, the truth. And in the end, it was the truth that came for him.